Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us. I am recording this meeting, so please be aware that it is recorded. But I am really excited to have a discussion about transdisciplinary natural hazards work because I do think this is a really important topic that people may be working in and they may be a little unsure about how to get started. And I think it's a great place to make sure that we're all on the same baseline so we can move forward together rather than um, rather than sort of trying to reinvent the wheel multiple times over. I think it's a very interesting topic that in some cases people don't get a chance to be exposed to until later on. And one of the things I was thinking about as I was actually getting ready for this was about how when I was applying for grad school, I reached out to several different advisors. And at one point, I asked not how people are working in transdisciplinary ways, but interdisciplinary ways. And one of the responses, and I don't remember who or where they're based, was, I know an engineer. And that was the beginning and the end of the answer to how are you working in interdisciplinary ways. And so it's really stuck with me. I mean, that was more than 5 years ago at this point. So I think it's really important to start with what transdisciplinary is. So there are three words that I think are thrown out a lot. They're similar sounding, but not quite the same: multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary. So my understanding is that multidisciplinary is drawing from many different fields. It's generally drawing knowledge, versus interdisciplinary is a step beyond, where a lot of people you're drawing from different fields and methods. Often there'll be multiple people involved and they'll end up meeting and discussing. But transdisciplinary really is above and beyond that. It's really synthesizing multiple disciplines to create something larger than its parts. So I would love to start with focusing on that. But if you have a different definition or understanding of this, I think that's probably a really important place to start about we're actually discussing. So we do have two wonderful speakers today. We have Dr. David Green from NASA in DC and Dr. Nania Campbell from the Bill Anderson Fund. So I'd love to start by asking both of you to just introduce yourselves, please. And if you want to change the definition of transdisciplinary we're working with, that would also be very welcome. Nania, would you like to start?
Sure. So I am a sociologist by training. I'm a disaster researcher. And so I focus on the social dimensions of disasters, the social impacts and causes and consequences. And so my experience with transdisciplinary work, and I think we'll get into this a little bit more, is that, and my definition is the same. That's always what kind of I've been taught, is that once it's a phased sort of approach, and once you get to this transdisciplinary level, that's when you're really creating something that extends beyond the disciplinary training that we get. But I still identify as a sociologist, in part because I have worked in interdisciplinary spaces. I've done multidisciplinary work, and we're, I think, always aspiring to get to that transdisciplinarity. But in my own experience, I have not gotten there yet. I think it's very difficult to do that kind of work, but I think it's worth aspiring to, particularly around really complex issues like hazards and disasters. So that's the lens that I bring to this work. And in addition to, just thinking about the complexity of disasters, given my role with the Bill Anderson Fund, which is a nonprofit organization that's focused on increasing representation among historically underrepresented minority groups in hazards and disasters. That's another dimension that I bring in, and thinking about how we transcend beyond academic boundaries, traditional ways of knowing, but also outside of science, especially science for the sake of knowing, but really figuring out how to get from that knowledge generation to social change space. So that's the kind of position that I'm taking, and how I'm thinking about transdisciplinarity. And I'm just looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Well, that was a couple of great introductions. I'm David Green from NASA Earth Science Program. The last few years leading the disasters program, and now launching a new program in wildfires. I've also worked in a number of other agencies on a variety of different aspects of natural hazards, from the physical science side and the social side, domestic and international. And in fact, I heard the discussions of kind of transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and multidisciplinary when I started to look at the relationship between hazards and health. and the particular impact there of what the community had come to talk about as One Health, the health of the environment, the health of people, the health of creatures, and that the idea that somehow we can certainly study individual areas, but our systems are connected. And so from my experience, I look at these as different levels of that connectivity, and that when we get to truly transdisciplinary, it's the flow of information and knowledge that's really important. The multidisciplinary still could mean you have excellence in all these areas, but you may not be able to really get to what I think we all share here is the idea of we want to understand behavior so we can appropriately impact the behavior in a way that we can adapt to or reduce a risk. But it really, we have learned, and I think we're all sharing here, is that in the past, there's been a lot of effort in these silos that I described. But now that we're seeing that the challenges ahead of us and the opportunities require a bolder approach, and that the curiosity that we have leads us in this transdisciplinary way. We just have to kind of allow it to happen. And I think this is what we're trying to explore. And the final note I just wanted to say here as we go into the discussion is I've had a lot of early career and even more mature academics and others ask questions because they didn't know there were opportunities, that this was actually something they could do, because we've often put people in individual departments, in a university or in a degree program, or even in an institution. We sometimes have separated ourselves. And I think what we're seeing now, and I get a lot of questions, and hopefully AGU and other societies, I think one of the most important things is to say, it's okay to be interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary. And in fact, it's encouraged and enabled. So I'll leave it there for now, but hopefully we can explore this in a really positive way forward.
I also would love to expand on that thought at some point too, because I think as students and early career researchers, we're encouraged to think about what we're doing next. And I think it can be relatively difficult when you are working across multiple fields to really figure out where you are going to fit sort of moving forward, and where you're looking for jobs, and how you can really show that it's an asset that you're working across multiple fields and you know how to work with other fields. That hopefully is one of those things that people start valuing more and figuring out how to sort of write things to be able to attract that type of researcher. It sounds like, at least you're seeing that there's an increasing role in transdisciplinary work throughout your career. And I was curious if you could talk about, it sounds like between health and geosciences, other ways you might be seeing that increasing, or synergies that you think might be important moving forward. And after, I'd love to hear your thoughts too, Nenia.
I think the increasing awareness and interest in climate change is just one that has really escalated and accelerated the importance of thinking transdisciplinary. The idea that we live in a dynamic world and that things are changing, that idea of change. The idea of change means that there are things that are going to interact in different disciplines. So the idea that population movement, for example, and the population dynamics will be influenced by climate change. So therefore you need to understand climate and weather patterns. You need to understand food system science and water system science, because the water patterns are going to change, which will in fact change the health patterns and the food patterns, which will in fact mobilize the movement of people in a way that we need to understand. And so as soon as you start to think about change on different scales, it opens up a series of science questions, which you can only learn by essentially, walking, as you said. You've got to actually work with an engineer. You've got to work with a social scientist. You've got to work with a hydrologist, the meteorologist, the population demographer. And in fact, I think what we're moving towards is really a new geographical science. That is really this one that is, by its nature, has been around for a long time. But I think the idea of these types of problems are bringing people around the table. The other thing that's happening at the same time, why now, is that we have a communications infrastructure, the media that we have, the geospatial information to map and model, to visualize, where we can actually bring things together in a way that we've never had before. And so the idea that we used to talk, and it's not because we didn't want to do the interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, but we also didn't necessarily have all the tools that we have now, the social media, the geospatial tools, where we actually can create a sandbox to work together. And I think that's what we're seeing, where a lot more students, a lot more people are using not only the integrated science, but the technology is enabling it to happen.
Oh, that's a great and sweeping answer. So I'll try to add something to that. I definitely wholeheartedly agree that there is greater, I don't see the interest in and support for transdisciplinary work decreasing. I definitely think that it is increasing, and in part in response to the challenges that we face. Climate change is one that comes to mind for me too, but even smaller scale series of events, looking at just individual hazards and disasters, and the fact that some areas are being affected in ways that are successive. They're having repeated disaster impacts, whether or not those impacts are attributable to climate change or some other phenomena that we're looking at as science teams. I think that we're at a point of complexity with societies and with how social life is organized that we have to start operating in different ways. We can't continue to operate in these disciplinary silos. And so in some ways it's a forced change. Our systems aren't always keeping up with that. Even the incentive structure for researchers and what kinds of work and what kinds of projects they can take on haven't always kept up. But I do think that there's more appreciation for the need for this kind of work. I also think that it's the only way that science can continue to be understandable and viable and relevant to the needs of people who are affected by the phenomena that we study. We can't just take a narrow approach toward explaining something, particularly in this age of skepticism towards science, lack of understanding and appreciation for science. And I think being able to work in ways that are transdisciplinary to communicate with other scientists opens the door to us understanding how to communicate with other kinds of audiences and to appreciate different ways of assessing the world, assessing a problem, and understanding it. And that's really important too. I think that as scientists of various stripes, we are under threat, not just from specific anti-science actors, but really just in terms of our relevance and how people see science and how it applies to their lives. And then just lastly, thinking about the impacts and the consequences for people and how we are really making our work relevant in their day-to-day lives and arriving at the kinds of solutions that are needed. I think it's a detriment to us to try to take one way of approaching a problem, one approach towards a solution, when there are different levels and scales and regions that we need to appreciate and understand how those things are influencing each other. So when we're looking at social systems, for example, we can't just have a technical solution and apply, a solution that, or an approach of looking at the problem that only accounts for one slice of the world. And even though it's not an earth sciences kind of problem, I always return to thinking about the pandemic and how well that illustrated it for those issues for us. So the idea that we could come up with a vaccine and then that would fix everything ended up not really being the case for multiple reasons, right? From people's acceptance of that issue, of that solution, from the complexity of global economic systems and how the pharmaceutical industry works, how we understand the biology of viruses and how those things work. And so I think that that's one slice that's easy for folks to understand and recognize in the context of their own lives, of why it's important for us to be able to extend beyond our disciplinary boundaries, and start thinking about collaborating in these kinds of teams where we can ask different questions, and approach the work from lots of different perspectives to appreciate the ways that these questions that we have kind of ripple out across the spectrum of disciplinary and life experiences.
I think some of the opportunities that are appearing, I wanted to pick up on the COVID example. One of the things that I think is an opportunity for people in early career, or even who are maturing their science but looking to expand into these transdisciplinary areas, is we're starting, and it is a struggle, to have the support either through grants, certification programs, or others, to ask questions that have not necessarily been supported before. And a specific example I wanted to give was, so COVID is happening, and there are concerns about what are the impacts on communities and the economy. And so there were questions that came to the earth science community that said, can we actually see those impacts? People are not moving around. Certain production has changed. Can we see what that impact is on air quality? Can we see what that impact might be on water? Someone came to us and said, can we actually use Earth observations and satellites to see when recovery happens from COVID? Because will the planet look like it's waking up again? And so we had people saying, in order to do that, I would have to connect my economic model with an Earth visualization that had never been done before. And people were saying, well, who supports this type of science? This isn't just earth science, it's not just health science, it's not just economics. But it was a really interesting question. Can we connect these to actually see the world recovering from COVID, and then maybe accelerate that recovery? And so people are starting to feel enabled to ask these questions. And those of us in different agencies who sponsor research, those of us in different institutions or working at a community level, I think we're changing our metrics for evaluating what are good science projects and what the impact is. And certainly the other point which I wanted to touch on here is the science, I think, has been for a while kind of detached from communities, from that social behavior piece. Certainly social scientists have kept it alive, and we appreciate that, but the rest of the community, I think, has been slow in recognizing how significant it is that the results of science are not just for other scientists or for engineers, but they need to be owned and implemented at the human level. And I think what we're seeing now is that science is becoming the ownership of the science problems. We're trying to bring to the idea within a greater cultural context, within that social context. It's been a long time coming. In fact, I think it existed probably 100 years ago. We lost it for a number of years, became very technical, and then we're kind of rediscovering it again. But I think that's the right path.
So I've been listening to both of you thinking about how these are huge topics that you're bringing up, and they almost seem like things that if you aren't working in this way, it's almost impossible to start. So the last time I was on a large interdisciplinary team, we started by writing a glossary basically. So we were all working from the same definitions, because then we weren't talking past each other because we just didn't understand what we were saying, because we were using words differently. Going back to a little bit about the communications comment. So I was curious, David, you're talking about certificates. I was curious where both of you thought, if you haven't been working like this, how you really sort of start moving towards this, besides just sort of writing glossaries and networking. Are there sort of smaller steps and bigger steps where people could think about moving towards this way? I should say I'm happy for either of you to start. I'll give you a chance to think, though.
You want to have a shot at that?
Sure, I'll take the first stab at it. I think definitely baby steps. Just reading journals, for example, or it doesn't have to be an academic journal, but online resources that are geared towards representing different disciplinary perspectives, understanding some of the foundational works maybe in other fields, is just familiarizing yourself with how different disciplines approach a particular problem even. So if you're interested in a specific hazard, looking at the different publications around that issue from the different ways that different disciplinary groups talk about that particular issue is one baby step towards even preparing for this kind of work. And also there are organizations and events that try to promote conversations across disciplinary boundaries and silos. So for example, the Natural Hazard Center at its annual Hazards Research and Applications Workshop is a great space for bringing together folks from different fields and kinds of professional groups, even not even just different scientific disciplines, but also policymakers, people doing research in non-academic settings, practitioners. And I think that that's another great way of starting to network once you maybe have a handle on the fact that different people, groups of people look at our challenges that are under our area of interest. And so starting to network in those ways. There are listservs where you can start to have some of these conversations, but I think appreciating the fact that most people are not doing transdisciplinary work, but starting to even connect across disciplinary boundaries is the first step towards getting there. And then, I think being able to build on those relationships and start talking about how we could approach a problem together, that starts to follow naturally after we start to make some of these connections. So for example, with the Bill Anderson Fund, with my work with these students, and they're all doctoral students across a range of academic disciplines, we have these conversations about how the students are looking at particular issues in their own work and the lens that they bring. And in some cases, those conversations that they've been having have enabled them to start collaborating on grant proposals together or on publications together. Just being able to feel like you're in a safe enough space that you're not going to say something dumb, that it's okay for you to not know the other person's language, but that you're open to having the conversation in the first place is really important.
Mm-hmm. So let me pick up on a couple of things. I think there are small and tangible steps that can go forward. And part of the first step is certainly look across the different disciplines that exist and the literatures that are used. There's a lot more communication channels now that inherently are attracting a multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary subject matter. But one area of this communication is who is really writing about the science and who is really communicating about the science. So one of the things that we've been looking at is working with minority serving institutions, tribal colleges, but not the science department, but the writing departments, the visual arts departments, those who are in communications, and opening up the perspective of being able to, how do we actually talk about this type of science? How do we actually communicate this? So there's one part of it is the doing of it. But the other big part that we have now that we need to do in parallel, which I think is a great opportunity, is that the whole act of the communication and the visualization of it is inherently an opportunity to be transdisciplinary. And what that is really talking about in our kind of natural hazards area is storytelling. It's how we do a better job of, and that's an opportunity that everyone can work on, is being a better storyteller of the natural hazards. The other aspect of this that I wanted to pick up, which I think is, again, opportunity steps that people can look for, are projects or pilot activities that focus inherently on the aspects of vulnerability of the hazards. So that aspect of hazard science. Once you start talking about vulnerability and exposure, you have to bring the different parts together, because you're talking about people and perspective. You're talking about infrastructure and lifelines. One of the things that's been done in recent years is this discussion of, well, why are we concerned with hazards? Because it disrupts our lives. It disrupts things. And what we want to do is use the increasing ability to not just understand the phenomenon, but understand the vulnerability and exposure. And those types of projects, if you look for those, or even if you remind someone saying, oh, great, you're talking about hurricanes and floods, what about the vulnerability and exposure? The minute you ask that additional question, your project or your activity suddenly invites that additional transdisciplinary aspect. It might be a new student in a project that wasn't there before. It might be getting some shared grants from groups that perhaps didn't realize they could both contribute to the project. But it also means you can take some tangible steps forward in this area of vulnerability and exposure. And I think we've been discussing that within the natural hazards area.
And I just want to pick up that thread briefly on vulnerability and exposure. I think that's such a great point, both in the ways that it invites that cross-disciplinary and collaboration that can lead to transdisciplinarity, but also then returns us to that concept of being able to communicate outside of the science community. I've certainly seen this with my work on geohazard scenarios, kind of looking at people developing earthquake scenarios and other kinds of scenarios, and then trying to figure out how to communicate that to others who would be responsible for mitigation actions. It's going from that concept of, how are we defining the hazard? What would happen? What are the technical elements of how this unfolds? But then the so what question is, how is this going to affect my constituents, right? What are the implications of this for our economy, for our most vulnerable residents? What would be the impact? And so I really love how introducing those concepts of vulnerability and exposure in particular opens the door to that next level too, outside of the science realm. So I just wanted to express my appreciation for that.
Mm-hmm.
I am listening to both of you, and this was not meant to be a recruitment pitch, although we were talking about recruitment before the beginning of this panel. But I think one of the things that is sort of really standing out is that there's the science, which we have in AGU a lot of different sections. And then there are a couple of the sections that sort of sit in a different field than the hydrology section, the VGP section. And I think the education section, and I guess science and society, I can't remember what their current name is, and natural hazards are really spanning across all of those other sections. And I think one of the things I'm hearing from both of you is that the natural hazards is, in order to sort of keep pushing the boundary forward, we really need to be working in this transdisciplinary space rather than in our single discipline, single section space. So I guess the recruitment pitch here is, if you want to keep having these conversations, to come join the natural hazards section, where we're having these conversations and not just staying in your own individual section.
Well, if you think about the AGU, and for those who recall the time when we actually everyone would attend in person, and I think of the aisles and aisles of posters and the individual rooms that people have their talks in. And you walk down and you see, oh, here's volcanology and here's hydrology. And one of the ways, very simple way, is go into an aisle you haven't been in before. Go into a room that you haven't been in before and find out that, one of the examples I often give is there's a set of conferences and community that call themselves Cities on Volcanoes. So it's not just about the volcano, but the fact that people live on them, and they live for good reasons, agriculture or historical, cultural. People live in low-lying areas on coastlines and subject to sea level. But if we would just open ourselves up a little bit, go into that room that has that session that you hadn't gone to before, just for your curiosity, go down that aisle that maybe is talking about an area that you're not familiar with. It's really can be quite opening. And I think the society and the natural hazards group, I think, could be one that becomes a kind of a meeting ground, if you will, to really be more inviting of saying, how do we can make those connections? Just like the Natural Hazards Center in Colorado. I mean, it's a wonderful opportunity. The number of people that come there, and I think they come there because it is a place where it's like a kid's sandbox where everyone comes to play and learn and interact. And I think we can promote that through the natural hazards community.
I'm going to jump in because Cities on Volcanoes is a conference that's held every other year. It does fall into my field of volcanology. So the next one will be in Crete and virtually in June. So the registration for that will be opening up soon, as abstracts are due the next week. And one of the great things about that is it not only is geologists from around the world, but also local emergency management officers, in addition to other industries, show up to those meetings. So that would be one of those places where you could go meet people, since there were a couple conferences that were mentioned. I do realize we have just passed the top of the hour. So if anyone has any last words of wisdom, I would love to hear you join at this point.
Well, I was going to say that I think that there's opportunities early in careers. So I encourage people to take advantage of internships and those opportunities to really explore areas. I think that's a really flexible and versatile time. But I'll also say that there's quite a few opportunities for those who are even mature in their careers that have perhaps established themselves in one area, but are perhaps getting into a rut, getting into a routine, going to the same place. That there are opportunities to kind of revitalize. And I think there's all stages of a career that we can encourage the opportunities and using different approaches. So it's never too late, it's never too early.
And the only thing that I'll add to that is just that you don't have to know how to do it to start working towards it. I know it can be really daunting, especially if you have only worked within your own discipline previously. But it's everyone is trying to figure this out. I don't think anyone has the perfect formula for how to be a transdisciplinary researcher. And so just taking that step and feeling, giving yourself some grace for that, I think is really important. So I just want to be encouraging of early career folks, of students who want to start doing this work, that you don't have to have it figured out. Just start having the conversations and then move on from there.
Thank you both for joining us. I've definitely taken a few notes during this, and I'm hoping that what you've said has helped others think about what they're doing and how they want to work moving forward. So thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it. And I am going to give a brief plug that the Natural Hazards Committee is working on a monograph about transdisciplinary ways of working and case studies. So keep your eyes open in the future. Thanks again, both.